In 1943, Paul Ricca was one of the most powerful men in the Chicago outfit. He was also about to become one of the most notorious federal prisoners in America. Ricca had spent years building his position inside Chicago's underworld, known as Paul the Waiter Ricca. He had risen through the outfit and became closely associated with its leadership. Then came Hollywood, and the Hollywood extortion case would send Ricca to prison for 10 years. He would ultimately serve only about 3.5. What happened between those 2 points became one of the most controversial episodes involving organized crime and the administration of President Harry Truman, the Hollywood racket. The case against Ricca came from a massive labor racketeering operation targeting Hollywood movie studios. The outfit had influence over the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. Beoff was a union official with connections to the Chicago mob. The operation used control over labor unions to pressure major movie studios. Paramount, MGM, 20th Century Fox, and RKO were subjected to demands for money. The payments were made in exchange for avoiding labor problems and other disruptions. The government eventually established that more than $1 million had been extorted from the movie industry. Beoff and Brown eventually cooperated with the feds. Their testimony led investigators directly toward the outfit's leadership. Ricca was indicted along with other major Chicago mobsters. Frank Nitti was also implicated, but Frank Nitti was terrified of returning to prison. On March 19, 1943, the day after the indictment was returned, Frank Nitti took himself out. That left Ricca in a dramatically different position. He emerged as a senior leader of the Chicago outfit. But Ricca wouldn't remain outside for long. On December 30th, 1943, Ricca and his co-defendants were convicted. The sentence was 10 years in federal prison. Ricca was sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. For a man who had just become one of the Chicago's most powerful mob leaders, prison presented a major problem. But the bigger problem was Atlanta. Ricca and other outfit prisoners feared that conditions there, particularly after another Chicago mobster, Phil DeAndrea, was reportedly beaten by prison authorities. Ricca wanted out of Atlanta, not out of prison yet. He wanted a transfer. The destination was Leavenworth, Kansas, and this is where the story begins moving from a criminal case into American politics. The Kansas City connection. Ricca's lawyers began trying to get the transfer approved. The normal requests failed. The Atlanta authorities opposed it. The Bureau of Prisons in Washington initially opposed it. Then the outfit went through political connections. One of the most important names was Paul Dillon, a St. Louis lawyer who had political connections dating back to Harry Truman's Kansas City political network. Dillon had worked with Truman politically, and now Dillon was involved in Ricca's attempt to move out of Atlanta. The request eventually succeeded. In May 1945, Ricca and several other Chicago defendants were transferred to Leavenworth, despite opposition from prison officials. That transfer would become extremely important, because Leavenworth put Ricca in a position where the outfit could begin working on something much bigger: parole. Murray Humphreys. One of the men who understood how to operate inside this political world was Murray Curly Humphreys. Humphreys was also one of the component shooters in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, but besides that fact, Humphreys was a senior figure in the Chicago outfit. He had spent years cultivating relationships with politicians, union officials, lawyers, and businessmen. That made Humphreys particularly valuable when the outfit needed something accomplished outside Chicago. And Paul Ricca's prison situation was exactly the kind of problem Humphreys specialized in. Murray had connections reaching into the Chicago politics and organized labor, while the Kansas City connection provided another potential route toward people close to Truman. The important point is that Humphreys did not need to personally approach Harry Truman. His value is in understanding who could approach whom. Ricca's case would move through lawyers. Those lawyers had political connections. Those political connections reached into Kansas City. And Kansas City was where Truman had built his political career. This created a chain of relationships surrounding Ricca's attempt to get favorable treatment. And that network became extremely important once Harry Truman was president. The Truman administration. By 1945, Harry Truman was President of the United States, and the man overseeing the Justice Department was Attorney General Tom C. Clark. Clark would become one of the most important figures in the Paul Ricca story. Clark controlled the Justice Department. These connections became part of the larger network surrounding Ricca's eventual release. But there was still a major obstacle. Ricca had a 10-year sentence. He had served only a little more than 3 years, and prosecutors did not want him released. The money problem. There was another obstacle. Taxes. Ricca and Louis Campagna reportedly owed hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes. That could complicate their parole. Money was raised to satisfy the tax obligations. There were also legal efforts to deal with another indictment involving mail fraud. The outfit hired lawyers to work on these problems. By the summer of 1947, Ricca's legal and political campaign was ready. Then came August. On August 6, 1947, Paul Dillon filed a formal parole application for Ricca and several of his co-defendants. The timing was extraordinary. The Federal Parole Board released them. Paul Ricca had served roughly 42 months of a 10-year sentence. The speed of the decision immediately attracted attention. The federal prosecutors who had put Ricca in prison opposed the release. The judge who had sentenced the men also objected. Yet the parole was granted. Paul Ricca walked out of federal prison, and Washington wanted answers. The investigation. The release created a political scandal. Congress began investigating how Ricca, Campagna, Gio, and DeAndrea had received parole so quickly. The congressional investigation examined hundreds of pages of testimony and federal records. The investigators were particularly interested in the political connections surrounding the case. There were allegations that money had been used to influence officials. There were allegations involving the Justice Department. There were allegations involving political favors. And there were allegations that the Chicago outfit had used its political influence to secure the men's release. But this is where the historical record needed to be separated from later Mafia mythology. There is no established proof that Harry Truman personally ordered Paul Ricca's release from prison. Truman was president, Tom Clark was his attorney general, and Clark's Justice Department was involved in the political controversy surrounding the parole. But that does not establish that Truman personally directed Ricca's release. The allegations against Truman. The allegations didn't disappear. Mobsters later claimed that the outfit had influence inside the Truman administration. Sam Giancana and other Chicago figures later described supposed deals involving Ricca, Clark, and Truman. Some accounts claim Ricca had promised Clark's political rewards. Other allegations claim that the outfit had provided political support to Truman. Those stories became part of the mythology surrounding the Chicago outfit's relationship with Washington, but they remain allegations. The congressional investigation established that the parole itself was highly controversial. It did not establish that Truman personally took a bribe or personally ordered Ricca's release. That distinction is important, because the documented story is already remarkable without turning the allegations into facts. Ricca returns to power. The most important consequence wasn't what happened in Washington. It was what happened in Chicago. Ricca had gone to prison as one of the outfit's leaders. He came out still possessing enormous influence. There was one problem. His parole conditions restricted his association with known criminals. So Ricca could not simply return to Chicago and operate openly as before. Instead, the outfit adapted. Tony Accardo became the public leader. Ricca moved further behind the scenes. That arrangement became one of the defining characteristics of the Chicago outfit. The organization didn't need one highly visible boss. Ricca could influence major decisions without constantly appearing in public. Tony Accardo could handle the day-to-day leadership, and the outfit can continue operating while keeping its senior leadership away from unnecessary attention. Paul Ricca had survived the Hollywood case. He had survived federal prison. And he had walked out after serving less than half his sentence. But the Truman controversy never completely disappeared. For the rest of Ricca's career, the 1947 parole remained one of the clearest examples of how organized crime, lawyers, political connections, and government institutions could intersect. Ricca himself rarely needed to be the public face. His influence became more valuable when it was hidden. And, alongside Tony Accardo, he remained one of the senior powers in the Chicago outfit for decades. The two men operated behind a succession of nominal bosses. No major decision could simply be made without the senior leadership's approval. Ricca eventually died in 1972. He had outlived the Capone era, survived the federal government, survived the Hollywood scandal, and remained a major force in the Chicago organized crime long after leaving prison.